Hello, this is the Provoked Prawn here with a detailed setup and wiring guide for the Lian Li SL Infinity 140 reverse blade fans, where I'm going to show you how to set them up alongside 120mm reverse blade fans, standard fans and more. I'm going to show you the wiring logic at a basic level and then a variety of details including the RGB controls and fan power controls in L-Connect later on, as well as another option that you can use that might be interesting, and that is the Razer Chroma RGB controller. So if you like Razer Chroma compatibility, this is one potential option which allows you to control the RGB lighting for these fans as an alternative to doing it with Lian Li, which also means that you can use signal RGB as well for some syncing there. These Infinity reverse blade fans come in single packs, which can cause some confusion and complexities when going about the wiring because you have limited options unless you already have the Infinity setup in your case with a triple pack of standard fans. More on that in a minute. But included in the single pack box is this connector, which has two cables on it, and then obviously some fan screws and some other bits as well. For this build, I'm actually using three 140mm reverse blade fans. I want to show you some things along the way. Now, you'll notice me removing the stickers from the mirror and from the sides, just to show it off before I even get started. I'd actually recommend leaving that till the last minute, because otherwise you will end up with fingerprints on those things, as I'll show you later. There are some interesting highlights to these, which obviously include connecting the fans together, but you can also remove the clips off the end. Now, with three fans unboxed, you can see we have three cables included, but if you're using them in a group with these three fans connected together, you'll only need one of those cables potentially. For most people, this is what you'll be doing. So you saw, for example, the clip at the beginning. I'm using these three fans, and the bottom of my case is intake fans, pulling air from below and blowing it onto the graphics card. And that's the benefit of the reverse blades. The way they're set up, the angle of the blades means that they pull air in. So you can just clip the fans together with relative ease and then obviously go about the wiring process and installing them in your case. And this is the direction you'd want them to face. It'll face upwards into the case. Now, there are three cables. As I said, you'll only need one at one end of the group of fans. You can see that it has some connectors on it, and it will only install in one direction, which is worth bearing in mind when you're trying to put it on. You'll notice on one end of the group of fans, there is a connector with multiple pins sticking out of it on that end, and that is where you need to slot that cable into. It'll only go in one direction though, so if you find it won't push in, you'll have to flip it around and do it the other way. Another point of note is that there's a little plastic cap on top, which you can actually pull off and remove. What this does is it enables you to flip the cable direction and then push it the other way, for example, and then put that cap back on. The reason for this is, depending on how you've installed these fans in your case, means that you can angle the cable towards the back of the case and make it a little bit neater, hiding things away and running your cable management in a much more effective way. It's a nice little addition to the setup there. But that's the basic setup with three fans and then that cable on the end. Now, if this is all you've got, and this is what you're included in the case, then I want to show you the simple wiring for that, because obviously we've got two connectors. One is the 5V RGB connector, which you'll notice has three pins on it. So we're looking for one of these connectors on your motherboard. It says 5V RGB. It may have other lettering on there, but notice it's 3-pin one. You'll sometimes find there's a 12V RGB connector that has 4 pins. You can't use that. You might find that you have multiple of these along your motherboard, so it's worth checking the manual. The other cable is the system fan header or chassis fan connection, which does the fan power. That then allows your motherboard to control the fan speed of those fans, and then the RGB is controlled by your motherboard software when using these two cables. Now, this is the basic setup. If you've just got three fans in your case, that would be really straightforward, but naturally you're probably going to have more than that. So if you have multiple RGB headers, that's fine because you can connect to other fans, but it can become a bit more problematic. Still, with just those two connectors, you can see you've got the fan spinning and you have the RGB lighting going. You control that RGB lighting with your motherboard software, MSI's Mystic Light, Asus's Armory, create the Aurora Sync in there, or something else. and then you just have some lighting there and basic controls. This is not the best way to do it though. If you want to get the most out of these fans, then you want to be able to connect them with the Lian Li setup so that you'd have L Connect, because you can do firmware updates. You have much more control over the RGB lighting and other things. Now you can see the reverse blade fans on here at the bottom row alongside the standard fans on the top. So it's a standard 140mm Infinity fans and the orientation of those. You'll notice the RGB lighting is the same, but it's the airflow that's different. And you will notice if you flip them over that the back is ever so slightly different. So if you have trouble recognizing which is which, this is worth paying attention to, because the cables are less visible on the standard orientation, because that's usually what you'd end up seeing is the back of the fans. They try to make it look a little bit neater. With the reverse blade fans, you don't need to worry about it. Now, as I mentioned, the best way to do this is actually to ditch the standard fan cable that's included and instead use the Infinity controller, which is included with a triple pack of standard 120mm Infinity fans. Now, unfortunately, you can't buy the reverse blade 140mm fans with the triple pack, so you can't get this controller like that. But if you have 120mm fans, you've got the triple pack, you've got this controller which has multiple ports on it and 4 cables included with it, which enables you to connect up to 4 groups of fans. And this controller does require some wiring and some complexities there that I want to get to, because it does cause some confusion and I've had a lot of questions about it over time. You can actually also buy this accessory box separately, which includes the controller and the cables you need. So I'll link to those things in the description, and hopefully that'll be helpful. If you're planning on just using 140mm fans in your case and you don't need 120mm, this might be an option for you. It's the same controller whether you buy the triple pack or the accessories pack, but you do need to make sure that you get the SL Infinity controller, not one of the other ones, because the TL, for example, won't work with this. So you can see here the setup for that includes multiple cables. You have this one, which has a little connector on it with the sysfan headers and 5V RGB connector. And there's a separate one for USB. Note, it's very important that you use the USB one for firmware updates and for controls in the software. There's also another cable, which is an adapter, which we're going to ignore for now. Now, this standard flat connector replaces the 2 cables that you'd get with the single pack of 140mm fans. This allows you to connect up to that control box and ditch the connections on the motherboard that you'd otherwise run from the cables on the fans to the motherboard. So now we're going from the controller to the fans directly with one single cable. Again, it has the same logic though. It has that little cap on top, so you can change the orientation of the cable if you want to. You'd then connect this to one of the ports on the controller, and then you have 3 fans controlled by 1 port, which you can then adjust in the Lian Li software, as I'll show you later on. This controller then has several cables to connect up that you do need to consider. SATA power, so 2 power connections to your power supply unit, USB, sysfan header, and 5V RGB header. You'll need the USB connection as a minimum, as well as the power ones, so that you can update the firmware and control both the RGB lighting and fan power via L Connect. If you plan on using L Connect, you don't need the sysfan and 5V RGB connections. Those are only if you want to control those things via your motherboard software, so it's worth bearing that in mind. But you can connect both if you want to. You do, however, need to connect the SATA power cable. So this is found on your modular power supply unit, and that's this flat cable here that you can see. So one end connects to the power supply with the SATA connection, clearly marked on the PSU as you saw, and then the other end connects up to the controller. Now I'd recommend connecting up both cables. This is especially useful if you plan on using the sync port, which I'm not covering in this video, but it was covered separately. And that enables you to make sure you've got enough power for all the fans and the RGB lighting. The other thing is that you'll then need to connect up to your motherboard in the various ways. So as I said, if you want to use the motherboard software, you use the 5V RGB connection and the sysfan header, same as I showed earlier on with a single fan connection, but find the relevant connections on the motherboard. And then you also have the USB cable. USB cable plugs into the bottom of the controller and then into the bottom middle of your motherboard, and that'll allow you to then control things and set it up properly, as I'll show you in the software in a minute. Now, all this wiring has obviously been outside the case. What you'd actually do is install the fans first and then plug it all in, but I wanted you to easily be able to see how those connectors work. So when you then go about installing the fans, and you'll notice the horrible fingerprints that I put on the mirrors because I did it after taking the protective stickers off, you can then go about plugging the cables in to the controller. And it's worth noting that if you're putting fans on a radiator, you can still use this controller as well. Just remember which one you've connected to on the relevant port on the controller, because you can then adjust the speed in the L-Connect software, as I'll show you in a minute, to account for where the fans are in the case and what they're mounted to, and adjust the fan speed accordingly. The end result now is, as you can see, we have all the fans set up, both a mix of standard fans, 140mm fans, reverse blade fans, and they're all managed from that same controller. So you can mix and match them if you want to. You can put 120mm and 140mm on the same controller, and reverse blade as well. So you don't need to worry about having separate controllers for all of those, which is worth keeping in mind. You can see here, for example, I've got both the reverse blade and the standard orientation 140mm on there. Now, I mentioned earlier on, as an alternative to this wiring, you can use Razer's Chroma RGB controller. Now, this is ever so slightly different because it doesn't do fan power, which is worth keeping in mind, but you can connect 5-volt connections to it. So on either side, there is 3-pin 5-volt RGB connections on there, so you can connect 6 potentially up to it. And obviously this will give you some interesting options because it is Chroma compatible, but it also works with Signal RGB and some other things, so you can sync your RGB lighting. Now this thing is a separate purchase, obviously. I'll link to it in the description, and it requires slightly different connections. So you can see it requires a Molex connection instead of a SATA connection, but it too also requires a USB connection. Now you'd use this instead of the Lian Li controller if you wanted to. I'm just giving you other options out there. You connect it up to your power supply unit using that Molex connection, which goes on the PATA connectors, same as the SATA one. So you have a cable that plugs in there, and then you've got this connection, looks like this, and you'd plug that in to the controller to give it power, and that would then be powered enough to be able to supply the RGB lighting for the devices. You plug the USB connection into the motherboard, and then you can control it with Razer's Synapse and Razer's Chroma software and adjust the lighting that way. So this is one option. Now, obviously, this only does the lighting, doesn't do the fan power, but you'd use the standard cables that are included with the single pack fans. So you then have the 2 connections. You plug one into the Razer controller, the 5-volt connector, and then the other one into the system fan headers on your motherboard. And what this would enable you to do is to then control the RGB lighting with a single controller, use Signal RGB, match it up with other things, sync it with Razer's various different products. If you're a fan of Razer products, this is a potential option. I'm going to go into more depth in this in a separate video, so if you're interested in seeing that, let me know in the comments down below and subscribe to find out more about it. Now, if we go back and assume that you're using the Lian Li controller, I'm going to show you a few different things that are important. First off is making sure you have the latest version of L-Connect. So head over to the Lian Li website and download the latest version. You can see what version is there. Uninstall any version you have currently if you do have one, and install the latest version. Watch out for any notices in here as well. You might find they're important. Update notifications in there. For example, on one version of L-Connect, you couldn't update the firmware through L-Connect. You had to do it separately. I would actually suggest looking at that as well, because if you've got any problems with the RGB lighting, this can be the good fix. Lian Li has a separate update tool for your firmware on the controller. If you click on the links in the description, I'll link to those directly. But this is a download that you have to download separately. And it's a tool that you can run that then looks for the controllers in your system and allows you to update them to make sure you've got the latest firmware updates. Download it, extract the files onto your PC, and find that relevant folder once it's extracted. You will then find there's a USB SP dialog tool in there. Click to run that and scan for the devices. Then from the drop-down list, select the relevant controller. You can see I've got 2 SL Infinity controllers in my system, and then you can click to then browse and find the relevant files for the updates. So in the files that you extracted, you should find the Infinity version of the firmware. I've obviously updated mine already, but find the latest version there. If you're finding that it's out of date, click on that, select it, and then do the start update process to update to the latest version for your controller. This will ensure the firmware is updated. Repeat that process for any other controllers that you have in your system. For example, I also have some streamers in my system as well, so you can do that and then update the firmware for those. And it's worth doing it with this tool because it just seems to be more effective than anything else. Then you want to look at Lian Li's Connect software. Now, there are a few things in here worth noting. If you go into the system, you will find that you can control the fan speed in various different ways through the fan profiles. You'll also be able to see which fans are running. So you'll notice this one, for example, on this controller, you can see the top 2 fans don't have any RPM speed. That's because I've not got anything connected to port 1 and port 2, but I have to port 3 and port 4. You'll notice that I have 2 controllers in here. And if you click, you can go into the settings and you can actually set how many fans you have on each port. So if you've made a mental note while you're doing it, then you can also select and tell Connect how many fans you have in there. And that's really helpful for the RGB controls because it'll enable the system to know how many fans are on each port and then adjust the RGB lighting accordingly. So I'd recommend going through here and then setting how many fans you have on each of those on the relevant ports. So if you've got one fan, for example, that's an exhaust fan and that's connected to the first port on one controller, and then other fans are in groups of 3, then select that and set that up there. And then you'll be able to adjust, and you can see you can switch between the 2 controllers and adjust the RGB lighting for each. You can quick sync the lighting on a different tab and enable you to control the fan lighting for all the fans in your system at once, which I find the easiest way to do. But if you want to manually adjust the lighting for specific fans, then you'd go in, set them as being on each port, and then go in there and adjust that. Obviously, the fan and pump profile is an important part of this. A few things of note: if you're using your motherboard connection, so the sysfan header and the 5-volt RGB connection, if you click this motherboard RPM sync at the top, you can turn that on so it will sync with your motherboard software. Turn it off and you use Connect software. So those are different switch between those. You'll notice on this controller here that I have the 140mm fan set up. So I've got 2 groups, 140mm, reverse blade at the bottom, and then also standard orientation at the top. I also have one 120mm fan at the rear of my case. So you can set those in there. And you can also find fan profiles down the bottom. So you can select and switch between quiet, standard profile, high speed, full speed, or custom. You can go into custom and you can adjust the fan curve accordingly. You can obviously set these so you can tune your system as you want to. I personally find that the quiet mode is a nice effective one. There's also start stop option. So for the 0 RPM, for example, you can set it, turn that on, and that will make your fans basically not spin unless they need to. So you can see the difference that makes the curve. They'll basically be at no speed at all until your system starts to get toasty. One of the things that you will notice, however, is that I also have GPU set here, because what you can do is you can adjust the fan speed according to the temperatures of either the GPU or the CPU. So because I have a reverse blade 140mm fans just below the graphics card, I've set them to GPU. So what this does is it actually changes the speed of the fans according to the temperature of that. If you look at controller 2, on controller 2 I have 2 groups of fans that are mounted to the radiator on my all-in-one cooler. These instead are set to control the CPU temperatures. So you can see here CPU on both of these. If the CPU temperature goes up, these fans will then speed up. So specifically, those groups of fans will speed up on the radiator and cool the coolant down inside, and therefore adjust accordingly. You could also set these to separate speeds if you wanted to, and you can do it individually. So you could set standard speed for one, quiet for another, although obviously if they're on the same radiator, you'd want to keep them the same. But you can adjust that, and you can see, again, you can choose from 120mm or 140mm. Now, when it comes to the lighting, the easiest thing to do that I like to do is sync the lighting across all of them. So you can pick a static color, for example, and apply blue to the entire system. But you can also go into the Infinity and you can control each of them in here and select what you want to. You also have the ability to change the profile from here as an alternative. But you can choose from the effects, and you'll see as well, you also have the option to choose the outer area. So these 3 options are essentially all the lighting. So this includes the middle of the fan blade, so the infinity mirror, or the outside bits, the ridge around the outside. You can select and set between those, and then you can choose from various different effects. You'll notice where you have this chain on the markings for the colors, that basically those allow you to be synced, so you can set those and you can go through and you can adjust each of the groups of fans and then change the lighting on those. You can also pick a group and then you could have different colors in each of the fans, so you could do that. You can either link the whole lot, or you could have different colors for each of them, so you could pick a different color for each of the fan in the group. And you can do it like that, so you could have interesting colors for all of your fans as an alternative if you wanted to. So those are the different options in what you can do. Hopefully you found this guide useful. If you have, check out the links in the description to other related content. Let me know down below if you've got any questions, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already for more useful videos like this in future. This has been the Provoked Prawn. Thanks for watching.
You've made it right to the end of the video, you brilliant legend you. If you've enjoyed it, click that subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, and drop me a comment down below if you've got any questions. If you really enjoyed it, consider joining the channel and see the benefits of doing so. Check out these other videos, you might well find them interesting or useful, and most importantly, have a great life.